Torchbearers of History, a connected series of historical sketches by Amelia Hutchinson Stirling. Chapter 10. Copernicus, the Renaissance, the Rise of Modern Astronomy. Copernicus has been called the great Columbus of the heavens, because he did for our knowledge of the heavens what Columbus had done for our knowledge of the earth. Strangely enough, too, his great discovery followed that of Columbus by only a few years. It was in 1507 that he is supposed to have reached his conclusions regarding the true nature and movements of the heavenly bodies, which I shall explain to you by and by. He lived in a very interesting time in the history of Europe, a time which has been called the period of the Renaissance. To explain what that word means, I must remind you of what I told you before, that after the fall of the Roman Empire, the great works of the Greek and Roman poets and philosophers and dramatists were neglected and almost forgotten. During the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, when the wild tribes of Saxons and Goths and Normans were settling in different countries of Europe, people were too much taken up with protecting their own country, or with invading some other, to be able to think of anything else. And it seemed as if the learning and art and civilization of Greece and Rome had been swept away by the great flood of barbarism that had poured into Europe, as if a torrent of mud had spread over the smiling fields, burying beneath it the fair flowers and rich crops of learning and art so diligently sowed by the Greeks. But during what are called the Dark Ages, those buried flowers and crops had been steadily pushing their way upwards through their dark coverings, and at length they reached the light and amazed men with their beauty. The Greek spirit, which had fallen asleep in Hypatia at Alexandria, awoke again, and the old Greek love of art and poetry and philosophy came once more to life. This reawakening or revival of learning is what is called the Renaissance. I cannot tell you all the causes which helped to awake men's interest in learning, but I may mention some of them. Of course, one of the great causes was that during the centuries since they had settled in Europe, the different tribes had been gradually becoming more civilized. Then Dante's great poem, written in the language spoken by the people, would help to spread an interest in reading. And Dante was followed very shortly by two other Italian writers, Petrarch and Boccaccio. More than a century after the time of Dante, the art of printing was invented, and you can understand that this would help to bring books within the reach of people who before had been quite unable to get them. But what is generally supposed to be the chief cause of this revival of learning is the fall of Constantinople in 1453. I have already told you how the Turks, a people of Central Asia, had risen to great power during the 11th century, how they had conquered and spread over the country of the Arabs, and how they had threatened Constantinople. 4 centuries later, they not merely threatened that great city, but actually besieged and took it. The last Roman emperor, who, like the founder of the eastern capital, was called Constantine, fell fighting bravely, sword in hand. The Roman Empire of the East had ceased to be. Henceforth, Constantinople was the capital of the Turkish monarchy. Many of the Greeks in the city had fled before the conquering Turks, and spread themselves over different countries of Europe, where they taught their own language, and helped at least to awaken amongst educated men a love of Greek literature and Greek learning. It was 20 years after the fall of Constantinople, when Columbus was preparing for his great discovery, by reading and pondering and studying the maps and charts, that Nicholas Copernicus was born in 1473 at Thorn, a town situated on the river Vistula, in which was then called the Kingdom of Poland. Look in your map of Europe at the country through which the Vistula flows, which Russia to the east and Prussia to the west of it That country is Poland. It is very far distant, as you will see, from Genoa, the birthplace of Columbus. The father of Copernicus was a doctor, and Copernicus himself studied medicine, first at the great Polish University of Krakow, and afterwards at the University of Padua in Italy, where he took his degree. Even as a youth, he had showed great talent for mathematics and astronomy, and after he left the University of Padua, he became professor of mathematics at Rome. Although he was wonderfully successful there, his lectures being attended by crowds of scholars, he did not remain long in Rome, but returned soon to his native country, and took his abode in the town of Krakow. Here he lived very quietly for several years, going out very little, studying much and observing constantly the stars and the heavens by the help of instruments which he himself had made. Afterwards he became a clergyman, and was made canon of Frauenburg, and this, of course, gave him many duties to perform, duties which he never neglected. But he still managed to find leisure to carry on his observations and his studies. It is in 1507, as I said, that he is supposed to have reached his great discovery in astronomy. During those years of study and observation, he had carefully noted the positions of all the planets, and he gradually came to see that his observations did not fit with the system of astronomy which had been believed in for centuries, with what is called the Ptolemaic system, from Ptolemy, the name of its founder. Ptolemy was the ancient astronomer of Hypatia's town, Alexandria, who lived about 3 centuries before her, in the 2nd century AC. According to him, the earth which we live on was motionless and fixed, while the heavens moved round in 24 hours. In this way he was able to account for the change of night and day. But Copernicus saw that much that he had observed in the heavens could not be accounted for by this theory. For long he could not trust his own observations or even his own eyes. It seemed much easier to believe that he had somehow made a mistake than that the theory which had been accepted by all the wise men who had lived during the last 13 centuries could be wrong. But at last, after he had again and again made his observations with the greatest care and with the same results, he was forced to come to the conclusion that the Ptolemaic system was wrong. But if the explanation of Ptolemy with regard to day and night, the seasons, and the other movements of the planets was not correct, what was the true explanation? Copernicus pondered long over this question without reaching any answer. But one day there flashed into his mind all at once, like a sudden revelation, what Pythagoras had said, the old Greek philosopher who had lived 20 centuries before, 7 centuries before Ptolemy, and more than 5 years before Jesus Christ was born. What if old Pythagoras was right after all, in what was with him only a guess? What if, instead of the earth of ours being fixed, it was really in motion? What if it, as well as the other planets, were constantly moving round the sun? Eagerly he turned to his observations, and found with breathless, awe-struck wonder that, with the help of the mere guess of the old Greek philosopher, he could explain everything that had been dark to him before. You have been accustomed to think of this earth you live on as moving. You have learned quite early on at school that day and night are caused by the rotation of the earth on its own axis, and the year by the revolution round the sun. But I am sure you can imagine the wonder, the amazement, the awe that filled the mind of Copernicus when this discovery burst upon him, when he realized what he alone of all the millions of human beings in the world knew, that the earth, apparently so motionless beneath his feet, was really moving more swiftly than the fleetest horse. He did not at once make known what he had discovered. He studied and pondered and observed as before, and the longer he pondered and the more he observed, the more certain he became that with the help of Pythagoras he had reached the truth. When he at last proclaimed his discovery, it was received as the project of Columbus had at first been received. Columbus, when he was trying to get the help of the King and Queen of Spain for his proposed voyage, had been brought before the council of clergymen to be examined, and these good men had not only scoffed at and ridiculed his belief that the earth was a globe, but had been even declared that it was profane, as being contrary to the doctrine of the Bible, and they quoted texts to prove this. It was with equal ridicule and with even louder accusations of profanity that Copernicus was met by his fellow men when he made public the conclusions which he had reached after so much patient thought and care. Fortunately, however, one or two learned men were convinced that his theory was right, and they urged him to expound it in a book. During the years that he was writing this book, he suffered much from the ignorance and unkindness of his fellow men, many of whom, though they were utterly ignorant of astronomy, thought they knew better than he, and looked with a kind of superstitious horror upon the man who had said that the solid earth was in motion. He was an old man, worn out with work, anxiety, and pain, when at last the book was finished and conveyed safely to the printing press in Nuremberg by a faithful friend. When it became known that the book was actually being printed, all the jealousy and ignorant superstition of his countrymen rose up in arms against him. He was denounced from the pulpit, and the people even attempted to break into the printing works in order to destroy the book. The printers worked at their types with a pistol lying ready at their side, and two faithful friends of Copernicus watched over the precious manuscript day and night. Meantime, Copernicus waited, in a state of most intense excitement and anxiety, to receive the book completed from the hands of the printer. Every day he dreaded to hear that it had been destroyed, and that the work on which he had spent his life was lost. The excitement was too much for his weakened health. He broke a blood vessel and sank rapidly into utter feebleness and helplessness. Still, though he knew that death was near, he hoped that he might yet live to see the publication of his great work. He longed to have some proof, before he died, that the fruit of his years of thought and study should not be lost to mankind. On the 23rd of May, 1543, he was sinking rapidly. The shadows of death were stealing over him. A hushed silence reigned in the sick room. Suddenly, life flickered up into the dying face. A look of eagerness lit up the sunken eyes. A horse's footsteps are heard approaching nearer and nearer. Even before the door of his room is opened, the dying man knows that he has lived long enough, that his work is safe. Soon his wasted fingers grasp the volume he has longed to see. Then, sinking back with a deep sigh, he faintly breathed his last prayer. Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace.